Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Meredith. Thank you so much for being here. Obviously, we're doing something a little different today. I thought that it would be so fun for the month of October to make our way through some gothic horrors. And we simply could not do gothic horror without talking about a Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, widely considered to be the king of all gothic horror. And what even better way to honor him than to finally conquer my fear of The Raven. In Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins, the entirety of the poem The Raven is in there somewhere. No spoilers, I won't tell you where, but it is in there. And I made a joke in that video about how at some point in my life, a witch cursed me to never understand The Raven. I try to read the poem and my brain just turns to fuzz, and I genuinely lose my ability to read, to understand language just in general. And anytime I go to read the words, they just fuzz over. And I got two really interesting responses to that. The first was a large number of people being like, no way, I also have the Raven curse. But I had a bunch of people actually explaining to me why that is the case with The Raven, the poem specifically. And so I thought we could talk about the reason why that is, and then dive into the poem itself and finally conquer it. You and me, we're gonna figure out this poem together. And then I thought it would be fun at the end to check my work and see if I got some of the symbolism correct and if I understood what the point of the poem was supposed to be. But that will be a live check on myself. I have not looked that up ahead of time. But before we fully dive in, you might have noticed that I am not dressed as a raven. The costumes aren't gonna match the books. I went with books I thought would be fun and costumes I thought would be fun, but they're not necessarily gonna align. And for our first one, I had to pay homage to my lovely black kitty cats, Stanley and Olivia. They are a mother and son, and they're adorable and perfect. But with that, let's answer the question, why is it so difficult to understand The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe? The main answer is that it is written in, and forgive me if I butcher this, trochaic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is what a lot of people are more familiar with. It's the cadence that Shakespeare wrote in. And iambic pentameter, there are these pairs of syllables where the stress is always on the second syllable. So when you read it out loud, it has this da-da, 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 da-da feel to it. That's iambic pentameter, right? Trochaic pentameter is the opposite. There's still 5 sets of syllables per line, but instead the stress is on the first syllable instead of the second. So instead of having that da-da, da-da feel, it has da-da, 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 da-da kind of feel. You'll notice that was harder for me to do. That is a significantly less natural feeling rhythm to our bodies. If you've ever wondered why they use the phrase downbeat and upbeat when it comes to music, if you have everybody in the room close their eyes and you play a piece of music and you tell everybody to bounce, and then you have everybody open their eyes, you will actually notice that everybody is going down on the same beats and up on the same beats. Our bodies have a natural rhythm to it when we're listening to music, poetry, whatever it might be. In poetry, the stress on the second syllable feels a lot more natural to us. And when the stress is on that first syllable, it feels way more unnatural, which is why Edgar Allan Poe wrote this poem in trochaic pentameter. It's supposed to give you a very uncomfortable feeling when you're reading it, and as a result, the pentameter that he wrote it in was to help him do that, and to help give the poem this almost unnatural sound to us as humans. So that is why there are so many people out there who feel like The Raven is so hard for them to read. I think especially if you are more of a phrase type reader, where instead of reading word for word, you kind of read a phrase at the same time. That's the kind of reader I am, and that's part of why I think now I've struggled to understand The Raven so much, because I'm trying to read the phrase, and the phrase feels unnatural to me. And when I say struggling to read The Raven, I should probably clarify what I mean by that too. I mean that when I'm actually reading it, like, it's almost like my brain tunes out and it's hard for me to like absorb the words. And for a long time, I've had trouble actually internalizing what the sentences say and what they mean. It's not that I've read the stanzas and just don't understand what they're supposed to represent. It's that the actual act of reading the stanzas is very difficult for me. I felt a lot of camaraderie with a lot of you in the comments under that video where I talked about it, where so many people were like, dude, that happens to me too. And we had some lovely poetry experts who were explaining why and explaining everything about trochaic pentameter, and it was all just so interesting to me. And so with that, I decided to sit down and say to myself, you know what, no matter how long it takes me or how word by word I have to go, I'm going to read this poem, I'm going to understand it, and I'm going to try my very hardest to analyze it. So now let's do that. With poetry, going through stanza by stanza as a unit is kind of important because the poet put it that way for a reason, right? So we'll pause in between stanzas and break down what we just read. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. So you see how it's just kind of like weird? Like it's just weird. Like, I don't know how to explain it. I just actually got goosebumps a little bit reading it out loud. It just feels like wrong. I don't know how to explain it. It's very interesting to me. So Once Upon a Midnight Dreary is a very famous opening. You might have heard that and not realize that was from The Raven. Obviously, we're setting a pretty dark tone here, trying to establish this is not going to be a happy poem. Once upon a midnight dreary, okay? Doesn't say once upon a midnight happy, once upon a midnight jaunt through town, once upon a midnight dreary. This is the educated commentary you guys come to me for. Okay. While I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. Our narrator, our person telling us this story, for some reason this person is weak and weary, we don't know why yet, they're reading. Interesting thing I want to call out is that it specifically says forgotten lore. There are many calls to different, both biblical and Greek religious things in this poem that I will call out as we read. It's a great rhyme, but there's also something there, I think, where it's specifically referred to as lore, and there's a lot of religious lore called to in the poem itself. It's the middle of the night, they're reading, and somebody comes tapping at their chamber door, but for some reason, they don't want to answer the door. Right? They're saying, oh, it's just a visitor, only this and nothing more. And they don't really seem to care that there's somebody at the door. Now we move on to the next stanza. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. This stanza seeks to explain to us why this person is so bleak. Why is it a midnight dreary? Why are they weak and weary? It's also establishing that this happened in the past. So distinctly, I remember it was in the bleak December. So this is a person thinking back to a time seemingly long ago. Surcease means relief, basically. So they were looking for relief from sorrow for their lost Lenore. For the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. At the end of the video, I might cut in some of the funnier times of me attempting to read these lines out loud and failing miserably. Obviously, this is somebody that he was in love with and he's lost her. And our narrator is saying that they had sought to borrow a relief essentially from their books, from their pain of losing their lost Lenore. Next stanza. And the silken sad uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, 'tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, this is it and nothing more. So we've already talked about the eeriness, the creepiness. This stanza to me really just stands to establish a little bit of tension and fear, right? The person is now feeling this weird discomfort with this person being at their door. In the first stanza, they were like, oh, it's just a visitor, who cares? But now they're a little bit like, wait, why is somebody at my door? In between these stanzas was a stanza of him thinking about his lost love. Did thinking about his love kind of wake up some of these fears to do with the visitor? Hold on to that. Presently, my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. Sir, said I, or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there, and nothing more. So our narrator starts to speak to the person on the other side of the door, asking their forgiveness and explaining that they were kind of half asleep, and that the initial rapping was so gentle that they hadn't heard. So they're scared, they're a little bit uncomfortable, they don't know who's out there, and they're trying to preemptively explain why they didn't answer the door right away, presumably in case they're upset or something, but when they open the door, there was nobody there. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore, merely this and nothing more. Edgar Allen Poe is a man of few words in this poem, and we're supposed to pick up a lot from the little we're given. And this is something I miss about old writing. Not to be one of those back in those days kind of people, but I I do feel like we've lost a little bit of the implication in the art of writing these days, and it feels like every author has this pressure on them to explicitly explain every scene and never leave the reader confused or wondering or picking up on subtext. And I do think that part of the art of writing is making it really clear what's happening while not always explaining it in explicit words. The reason why I say all of that is because in this stanza, we are led to think that our narrator is starting to wonder if the ghost of Lenore or if a zombie of Lenore is outside and who was knocking on the door. The long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. So we have wondering, then fearing, then doubting, then dreaming, right? So we have two positive words kind of on the outskirts, but they are sandwiching two negative ones. No mortal ever dared to dream before. And I think that's supposed to kind of lead us to see the narrator as somebody standing there somewhat afraid of the idea that potentially the ghost or zombie of Lenore is out there, but is partially hoping that she is because he misses her so much. And he starts with, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word Lenore, but then reveals that he was the one who whispered it. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore. So he whispers the word Lenore into the hallway and hears it echoed back to him. Merely this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. There's not much here, other than whatever it is outside the window, not outside the actual door. Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. Obeisance means to greet in a respectful way, think like a bow or a curtsy to a royal. So our narrator opens the shutter to the window and in walks this raven. Presumably this raven was the one doing the tapping, the rapping on the chamber door, if you will. He doesn't really acknowledge the narrator at all, just flies above his chamber door and perches on a bust of Pallas. So Pallas has multiple references within Greek mythology, but the strongest that I found, that I think is the most likely, is a sea nymph and a warrior known for her close relationship with the goddess Athena, and she is accidentally killed. So the reason why I think that this is the Pallas that is referred to here is because she dies accidentally and young, and that's a large part of her role in Greek mythology, is that she was accidentally killed by Athena, who she was very close with when she was very young. And not only that, but a statue of her is called the Palladium, that within the mythology was believed to have been built by Athena in her honor. The word palladium has been used figuratively to mean anything believed to provide protection or safety. And so partially because she was a maiden who died young, partially because there's a statue of her that's part of the Greek and Roman mythology, and partially because the word palladium grew to mean protective thing, and this is hanging above his chamber door. Like, all of that leads me to believe that it's this Pallas and not the Titan that this is supposed to be a bust of. And so the raven sits right above this bust of a woman who died young, but is also a protective symbol. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. So this is the first that the line, quoth the raven, nevermore, appears in the poem. It's going to repeat multiple times, and that is not just a famous aspect of this poem, but arguably the most famous aspect of it is the line, quoth the raven, nevermore. But the night's Plutonian shore is the boundary between the living and the dead. And so our narrator is essentially saying, you're not a raven. You must be like a lord or a representative from this like boundary between the living and the dead. You must be something special or unique. You must be a symbol in some way. This has to mean something, right? There has to be some depth to this. Surely you're not just some random bird flying in the middle of the night and disturbing me. Remember that he's searching for like this deeper meaning behind the presence of the raven. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door. Bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door. door with such a name as Nevermore. Who are you? What's your name? You must be from the night's Plutonian shore. And the raven responds with Nevermore. And so the fact that the raven speaks back is obviously very jarring to our narrator. It clearly wasn't really answering his question, and so he assumes the name of the raven is Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. So the bird flies in. He says, surely you're not just a raven. What's your name? The raven says, Nevermore. He takes that to be the raven's name, but then the raven says nothing else. And when he says, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before, then the raven responds, Nevermore. The raven seems to just be repeating the word nevermore. But that line, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. So again, we seem to be referencing Lenore's death, and potentially not just Lenore, just death in general, and potentially other friends that have died as well. And so he's saying tomorrow this raven will also leave, as my hopes have flown before. But the bird says Nevermore, which is actually kind of a reply to what our narrator has said, which the narrator also remarks. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store. Caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of nevermore. This is one of those stanzas that I was reading and I was like, man, like it's just so hard for me to like follow it. You know what I mean? I don't know how to explain what I mean. He starts it by saying, startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken. So he's remarking on the fact that it almost seemed like the raven was responding to him, but he also notices that this is the only word the raven's saying. So he immediately says to himself, oh, he must have had some master that was just experiencing a bunch of, disasters or wasn't living a very good life or whatever, potentially said the word nevermore a lot, or actively taught the raven the word nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird, bust, and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. So here I wrote a note that I still find really interesting, and I don't know exactly how I feel about it. He pulls up a chair to the raven and starts to essentially try to figure out what the raven means in repeating the word nevermore again. And I almost feel like this stanza is just the tiniest bit of a fourth wall break, but not really. It felt to me when I was reading it that by having the narrator try to figure out what the bird means by nevermore is almost a stand-in for the reader trying to figure out what Edgar Allan Poe means by having this raven that just repeats the word nevermore. So we have a character within this poem that is seemingly trying to interpret the symbolism behind the presence of this raven and it's saying the word nevermore out loud in a way that I just thought was like really clever and kind of fun. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. So he's thinking in silence as to what the raven could mean, and while he's leaning up against the chair, he thinks about Lenore again. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, that God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. So seraphim is an angel. Nepenthe is a drug from Greek mythology that banishes grief or trouble. So our narrator was trying to figure out what the metaphor, the symbolism behind this raven and it saying the word nevermore over and over again. What could the raven mean by this, right? And then he thinks about Lenore while he's thinking about it and he's like, oh, God sent this raven to distract me from my grief over Lenore and to help me forget my lost Lenore. The raven is only saying the same word over and over again, but seemingly is responding to our narrator saying, drink the drug and forget Lenore. And then the raven says, nevermore. Now, obviously the raven is still just repeating the same word over and over again. It's unclear to me if the raven's trying to say, nevermore will you forget Lenore, or nevermore will you miss her. But his response kind of implies to me that he thinks that the raven is saying to him, never again will you miss her. Because then he says, prophet said, I think of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest to toss thee here ashore. Desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore. Is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. With the capital letter here, he's talking about the devil when he says tempter. And then tempest is like a storm, right? So he's basically saying, are you prophet, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil. So whether sent by the devil or whether just tossed here by a storm. He's basically asking, like, is there anything that will make me forget her? Whether the devil sent you or whether you were just kind of tossed here by a storm or at random, tell me, is there anything in Gilead is like utopia almost, refuge, heaven, like not quite heaven, but just like a refuge. Is there balm in Gilead? Basically saying, like, is there any refuge anywhere for these feelings I have about Lenore? And the raven says, nevermore. So then our narrator comes back with the same opening line. Prophet said, I think of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore. Tell the soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aden, it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. So now he's back to saying, oh, this bird is sent by God, and is saying, tell me that one day when I'm in heaven, because Aden is like also heaven, when I'm in heaven, shall I be again with Lenore, basically. And then the raven says, nevermore. It feels as though the raven is just continually saying no back to him, even though all the raven is saying is nevermore, right? Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy break from out my heart and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. So obviously he's very upset by the raven telling him both that there's no real balm in this life for him missing Lenore, and also that he will never see her again, not even in some kind of afterlife heaven situation. And he's saying, you must be lying, get out of here, you cursed bird, get off my bust, quit the bust above my door, get out of here. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So if you'll remember back from the beginning of the poem, the narrator says something about, I remember it was back in this bleak December. So when we get to this, and the raven never flitting, still is sitting, implies that however much time has passed between the raven's initial arrival and now, that the raven is still there and is just sitting on the bust of Pallas above his chamber door, and the eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. However much time has passed, the raven is still there. And then the lines about throwing the raven's shadow on the floor, our narrator references, my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So I believe that that's supposed to be that the raven's shadow is being cast from the lamplight and it will never be lifted from the floor, and neither will his soul, right? You end this out and it feels pretty obvious that the raven is supposed to be a metaphor for grief almost in and of itself. Our narrator has lost his love, Lenore, and is trying to seek escape from it in all these different books, and it comes to the door and it's insistent with the tapping. It insists upon being let in, and once it is let in, it just sits and stays and doesn't go anywhere and is just there and is ever present in this narrator's life. And all of the stuff about, you know, oh, you're here to distract me, and then, oh, well, is there anything that can distract me? Is there anything to make me feel better? Am I ever going to see them again? Like, all of these, I think, are very common thoughts when you lose somebody. And so the narrator is, in a way, in this conversation with the raven, when the raven keeps contradicting itself because it's just saying the word nevermore over and over and over again, is seemingly like our narrator is kind of ping-ponging back and forth. The bird is from God and is trying to distract me. Okay, no, that's not true. So the bird must be from the devil. And is there anything that I could take? Anything that would distract me? And then no, again, oh, you must be from God. Am I going to see Lenore again in heaven? And then, oh no, you are from the devil. You are a demon, right? The narrator is kind of ping-ponging back and forth. And we're watching as they kind of go through these stages of grief as a result. difficult. And I think especially because the raven remains perched on the bust of a woman who lost her life very young, it's supposed to be his grief, I think, with Lenore. And I feel like that's pretty obvious, so I'll be very surprised if I'm wrong. But now we're just going to look up the Raven analysis, and I'm going to read a few other people's analyses. After admonishing himself to forget Lenore, the speaker takes advantage of the Raven's refrain to wallow in his grief, asking questions that he knows the bird will have one response to: nevermore. This demonstrates that the speaker doesn't truly desire to forget Lenore. He opts to dwell on his grief and uses the Raven's presence to do so. Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. In addition to the events of the poem highlighting the endlessness of grief, the poem structure urges the reader to remember Lenore's name. In the rhyme scheme ABCBBB, the B rhyme that repeats for more than half of each stanza is always Lenore, or a word that rhymes with it. The sound of her name echoes throughout the poem, reminding the speaker and the reader of the unending nature of the speaker's grief. Ultimately, by the end, the speaker knows that he will forever have the cloud of Lenore's loss hanging over him. That's an interesting thing. I didn't notice that a lot of the words used in the poem rhyme with Lenore's name. All right, let's look at litcharts.com. Okay, well, now this person is saying Pallas Athena is the Greco-Roman goddess of wisdom and learning. I was reading that they're different goddesses. The bird's landing place on the statue therefore implies a kind of opposition to such rationality. Okay, well, I don't think that that's correct. I don't think that that's who Pallas is. But that's what I'm saying. Like, there were so many definitions of the word palace when I was looking that up. I could be wrong. I don't know. So the main thing that I'm finding that's a little bit different from what I said are people saying that the raven, part of what it's supposed to represent is a little bit of denial in grief, and that the narrator knows that the raven is going to answer every question with nevermore, and yet he asks them anyway, and is upset and seemingly surprised by the raven's responses, which I find an interesting thing to point out, because he does do that, right? He does know what the raven's going to say back, but he asks the questions anyway, and he's hoping for a different response, which I think is also symbolic of one in grief, right? You know the person is lost, you know they're never returning, and you can only hope to see them again in the afterlife. And yet we have this, maybe they survived somehow, or maybe they'll come back from the dead, or whatever it might be, these somewhat irrational thoughts of like, what if, right? Somebody also point out that because the narrator was kind of dozing off at the beginning, it's unclear whether or not the interactions with the raven are a dream or are happening in real life. But all of that to say, I am happy that I sat down and did this, because this poem is really smart, and obviously it stood the test of time for a reason. It's very good, and I was having a lot of fun actually going through the stanzas, and once I understood what each line was saying and what each word was saying, could really like read it and analyze it and interpret it, then there was an appreciation in it for me that I didn't have before, and it really is quite beautiful. Obviously, quoth the raven nevermore is a very, very famous quote. There's something about even the line itself that feels so final, right? Even just saying the line, quote the raven nevermore, out loud, like it feels very much like an ending, which is probably part of what the point was, right? Is that death is final, and Lenore's death is final, and there's nothing our narrator can do to change that. I appreciated specifically the horror take on grief. It's not unheard of to do that, but I feel like it is a more rare way to work through the concept of grief, to do it in a way where your grief is haunting you almost in a horror sense, the way that this raven is somewhat haunting our narrator. There's this creepy, eerie aspect to it, but I do like the idea of exploring grief almost as a fear and like a horror and something to haunt you and something to be, in a way, afraid of experiencing. I'm 100% positive Edgar Allan Poe isn't the only person to have ever done that. In fact, a lot of the horror genre can be very disrespected by people who don't really understand it and don't understand that horror can be a genre that's also used to explore some of these darker themes, and that the horrific monsters in horror are sometimes meant to represent things we can experience in real life, even if what's happening in the movie is somewhat fantastical. And so I just enjoyed that. I enjoyed reading a horror where the haunting thing, the monster, if you will, almost the scary thing, is that feeling of grief and that emotion. I thought that was really cool and very fun. And like I said, forcing myself to actually read this poem and understand it gave me an appreciation for it that I feel like I didn't have before. Let me know what you think. Do you also have the Raven curse, and did I cure you of it? Let me know in the comments down below. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books of Surcease of Surcease for the rare and radiant maiden whom the name oh my god, and the silken sad uncertain rustling of each purple curtain Wait, I don't think I did that right. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Okay, I need to make visitor 3 syllables. Okay. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams nor mortal. No. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Yeah, that's fine. Let me see then what their read is. How do you say that? Okay, Google doesn't know that word. No, I don't want threat. At that place. They're at. Oh my god. Here I thought it was like this fancy word I'd never heard of. I'm like, what's the read? They're at. Okay, they're at. I know how to say those 2 words as separate words.